There is a model. It runs quietly in the background while markets talk about soft landings, while politicians talk about resilience, while households keep making payments on the assumption that next quarter will look enough like the last one to stay alive. The model does not care about narratives. It reads labor data, consumer spending, manufacturing orders, credit conditions, financial stress, energy prices. It takes the noise of the economy and compresses it into one number, one probability, one line on a scale that says whether the United States is heading toward recession in the next 12 months. It is maintained by Moody's Analytics, and it has one property that makes it dangerous. Every single time that number has crossed 50%, a recession followed. Not most of the time, not usually, every time. Across 11 American recessions since the Second World War, 80 years of history, 0 misses. In February 2026, the model reached 49%, 1 point below the line that has never been wrong. And that reading was taken before the latest deterioration fully entered the machine, before the newest energy shock moved through the full data cycle, before the March consumer panic was properly absorbed, before the next employment print, before the oil spike began bleeding into confidence, freight, food, and spending at the same time. The number is already at 49. The inputs are getting worse. And if you are a household in Brampton, Calgary, Windsor, or Halifax, that number is not an American curiosity. It is a countdown attached to your mortgage renewal, your job security, your grocery bill, and the next policy decision from a Bank of Canada that is already trapped between inflation from outside and weakness from inside. In the Hormuz trap, we showed you why Canada cannot survive the next oil shock. In the stagflation trap, we showed you why central banks cannot rescue you from it. This video is the missing third layer. This is the model that is about to call the timing. The line is at 49. The next print absorbs the damage, and the model has never been wrong. This is the 49% line. The power of the number comes from what it is not. It is not a headline. It is not a pundit's mood. It is not a television panel guessing whether the vibes feel recessionary. It is a pattern recognition system built to identify the combinations of weakness that have preceded every modern American downturn. It takes a wide spread of leading indicators and asks one question. Does the current structure of the economy resemble the structure that existed before prior recessions? When the answer is no, the number stays low. When the answer starts drifting toward yes, the number rises. And when it crosses 50, the historical record says the recession clock has already started. That matters because ordinary economic commentary usually fails in the same way. It gets trapped arguing about one data point at a time. One jobs report, one inflation print, one GDP revision, one oil spike, one market sell-off. That is how people miss the whole picture. They wait for certainty in one indicator while the system is already weakening across 6 others. The model does not make that mistake. It is designed to read deterioration as a cluster. Weak labor, weak confidence, weak output, tightening credit, energy stress, asset repricing. One by one, none of those conditions has to mean recession. Together, they create the fingerprint. That is why the line matters. Not because machine learning is magic, because pattern recognition is exactly what recessions hide behind until they are too obvious to deny. And this is where the channel logic gets strong. The Hormuz trap gave you the physical shock. The stagflation trap gave you the policy paralysis. This file gives you the signal that tells you when the macro damage is becoming too large to contain with narrative management. The model is not predicting the trigger. The trigger is already visible. The model is measuring whether the body can survive it. The answer is getting closer to no. The model does not predict the panic. It measures the fragility. Tell me in the comments, do you trust a model with an 80-year record, or do you think this cycle is somehow the first exception? The line did not rise to 49 because of one bad month. It got there because almost every important input has started moving in the wrong direction at the same time. Start with labor. The United States lost 92,000 jobs in February. Outside the narrow areas still absorbing workers, the labor market has been losing momentum for months. This is how downturns usually begin, not with one spectacular collapse. With quiet exhaustion, less hiring, fewer openings, more caution, payrolls that stop expanding fast enough to absorb new weakness. Then comes confidence. Consumer sentiment is not a luxury statistic. It is the emotional balance sheet of the household sector. When that index collapses, it tells you something vital. People do not just feel pessimistic. They start changing behavior. They delay purchases. They hold cash. They cancel plans. They stop assuming the future will be easier than the present. That mood change feeds directly into spending, and spending is the engine under the American economy. Then comes output. GDP growth slowed sharply, not to collapse levels, but to the kind of level that matters in the late stage of a cycle, weak enough that any external shock hits harder, weak enough that the economy enters the next stress event with no cushion, weak enough that a supply shock is no longer striking a healthy body. It is striking one that was already tired. Then comes oil. This is the decisive layer, because higher energy prices do not stay inside the energy sector. They move into trucking, shipping, fertilizer, plastics, food, utilities, airline routes, insurance costs, and the psychology of every household that has to fill a tank before they can even think about discretionary spending. That is what makes this moment different from a clean recession call. This is not just a domestic slowdown. It is a domestic slowdown meeting an external price shock. That is the kind of combination that turns weakness into a hemorrhage. And the line at 49 was reached before the full March damage entered the data stream. That is the part people are underestimating. The model is already sitting 1 point below the threshold, while still reading a world that was less damaged than the one we are standing in now. In other words, the 49 is already stale, and stale in the wrong direction. The model is reading yesterday's weakness, while tomorrow's shock is already here. Without the history, 49 is just a dramatic number. With the history, it becomes a warning label. Because the point is not that the model exists. The point is that it has been here before. The last time it reached this kind of level outside a live recession was 2007. Before that, it rose ahead of 2001. Before that, ahead of 1990. Before that, ahead of the early 1980s. Before that, ahead of the oil shock recession in the 1970s. The pattern repeats because recessions do not arrive as surprises to the data. They arrive as surprises to the people who refuse to read the data honestly. That distinction matters. A recession usually feels sudden only to the public. To the ledger, it has been forming for months. Labor weakens first at the margin. Confidence slips next. Growth slows. Markets start repricing. Credit conditions harden. And then one visible shock, an oil spike, a financial failure, a policy error, a war, a demand collapse, takes a body that was already fragile and pushes it over the line. That is why the historical record is so useful. It strips away the fantasy that every downturn is a random event. It is not random. It is cumulative. And this is where the model becomes much more than a US signal, because Canada almost never gets to remain untouched by American recession dynamics. The United States is not just another economy beside Canada. It is the dominant buyer, the dominant financial gravity, the dominant demand partner, and the dominant source of transmitted weakness when things start failing south of the border. So when the American data cluster begins to resemble prior recession clusters, Canadians should not read that as foreign news. They should read it as incoming weather. That is exactly what we opened in the 51st state trap and the passenger seat. Canada likes to describe itself as sovereign in rhetoric while living as a passenger in macro reality. When the driver swerves, the passenger still hits the windshield. That is the historical lesson. The model does not tell you the exact day. It tells you the weather system is already forming. Recessions do not come from nowhere. They come from ignored deterioration. Quick poll in the comments. What matters more right now, the oil shock or the labor slowdown? Now bring it home. If the line crosses 50 and the record holds, the United States enters recession within the next year. That is not an optional event for Canada. The export link is obvious. The capital link is obvious. The currency link is obvious. When American demand weakens, Canadian output follows. When U.S. firms cut orders, Canadian suppliers lose volume. When U.S. markets de-risk, Canadian markets do not remain untouched. And when the U.S. economy contracts into an oil-driven inflation environment, the pressure on Canada is worse because Canada enters the cycle with a more indebted household sector and a more fragile housing structure. That is the real crisis. Canada is not arriving at this possible recession from a position of strength. The Bank of Canada is already holding rates while growth weakens and unemployment rises. The household is already over-leveraged. Mortgage renewals are already rolling in. Youth unemployment is already elevated. Per capita pain is already visible. So if the American economy crosses from slowdown into recession while oil remains elevated, the Canadian household gets hit from 3 directions at once. Income risk from weaker labor, cost pressure from energy and food, debt service pressure from renewals, and a central bank that cannot simply slash rates without importing more inflation through the currency and the fuel channel. That is why a model in Washington matters at a kitchen table in Brampton. The line is American. The bill is Canadian. And unlike the United States, Canada does not even get the comfort of being the reserve currency issuer inside the storm. It drains the household from both sides, importing the weakness and importing the price pressure, while pretending it has a clean, independent response available. It does not. The American recession line is rising, while Canada is already walking into renewal shock and wage weakness. The two systems are chained together. One data update south of the border becomes a household problem north of it. That is not abstract macro. That is a delayed invoice. America prints the signal. Canada receives the invoice. If the line crosses 50 and the recession pattern holds, the sequence is not mysterious. Markets fall first, not all at once, not evenly, but enough to hit confidence and funding conditions. Equities reprice before layoffs become front-page truth because markets discount the next stage of weakness before households fully feel it. Hiring freezes second. That is how labor pain enters the system quietly. Firms stop expanding before they start cutting. Young workers and job switchers feel it first, then contractors, then marginal full-time roles. The labor market looks stable on paper, even while the actual opportunity set is shrinking in real time. Consumer spending weakens third. That is the engine room. Households do not need to panic for spending to contract. They just need to get cautious. One fewer dinner out, one delayed appliance purchase, one canceled trip, one decision to hold cash instead of spending it. Across millions of households, that caution becomes output weakness. Credit tightens fourth. Banks get selective. Refinancing gets harder. Small businesses face tougher terms. Households needing flexibility find less of it available. In Canada, this matters more because credit tightening lands on a population already facing mortgage rollover. The household does not only meet a weaker economy, it meets a weaker economy while its largest monthly liability is being repriced. Then the depletion of fiscal room accelerates, tax revenue softens, deficit pressure rises, political promises get thinner. Rescue becomes more expensive or less willing to finance fantasy at the old price. That is the cascade. And the crucial point is this. The recession does not begin when television declares it. It begins when the sequence starts. By the time the official label arrives, hiring has already slowed, spending has already weakened, and households have already started cutting back. That is what makes the 49 so important. It is not a verdict on the future. It is evidence that the sequence may already be underway. The recession starts in behavior before it appears in headlines. Close the folder. There's a line. It sits at 49. It has never crossed 50 without a recession, following inside the next 12 months. That reading was taken before the full damage of the oil shock, the confidence collapse, and the newer labor softness had fully entered the model. The next update will see a weaker world than the last one did. And that matters, because the line does not exist in isolation. It sits beside weaker payrolls, weaker sentiment, slower growth, higher oil, falling markets. And central banks that, as we already showed in Knowing to Canon, the stagflation trap, are stuck between inflation they cannot ignore and weakness they cannot cleanly relieve. That is the real message. The model is not magic, it is a mirror. And right now, the mirror is showing an economy that looks increasingly like the economies that eroded before the public noticed. For Canadians, the meaning is even harsher. Because Canada enters this possible recession with less household room, more housing sensitivity, and more dependency on U.S. demand than the public likes to admit, the model is reading American data. But in a branch plant economy tied to the same continental machine, American recession probability is also a measure of Canadian coming pain. That is why this number deserves attention. Not because one model should rule your life, because one model with an 80-year record is now sitting 1 point below its danger threshold, while almost every major input around it is deteriorating. You do not need to worship the model, but you do need to understand what it is saying. It is saying the system is near the line. It is saying the buffers are thin. It is saying the next shock does not need to be enormous if the body is already this fragile. And for a generation trained to believe the rescue always comes, that is the most dangerous part of the file. The rescue is no longer guaranteed. The line is getting closer, and belief is running into arithmetic again. The line is not the crisis. The line tells you the crisis is close enough to smell. Drop A like so more households see this before the next data update. Subscribe for the economic truths nobody else will say out loud. Tell me in the comments, are you making decisions right now like a recession is coming, or are you still betting the system finds a way out? I am Hoch, and I will see you in the next one.